His opposition, the Rebbe said. How could there not be opposition to me, seeing as I am traveling a new path that no man has ever traveled before, less than not even the Baal Shem Tov or any other living being greater than. It is a very old path, in fact, and yet it is completely new, he said. Even if the Baal Shem Tov were alive, he could not compare with me, he said. There are people who do not know me at all, yet they are still opposed to me. He went on to quote the passage in the Zohar, "Come, let us deal wisely with them." How could you imagine, the Zohar asks, that Pharaoh went up to each person and said, "Come, let us deal wisely with them"? But he put it into their hearts. 395. Reb Udal gave me an account of a conversation the Rebbe once had with him, in which he said that Abraham also suffered the same kind of opposition he himself had, for Abraham also worked with young people to try to bring them closer to God. The sources specifically mention Abraham's proselytizing activities. He would come into the city and run about crying, "Woe, woe," and people would run after him the way they chase a madman. He would argue with them at length, trying to show them they were all caught up in a profoundly mistaken way of thinking. He was quite familiar with all the arguments and rationalizations they used to justify their idolatrous practices. The idolatry of the ancients was bound up with all kinds of spurious beliefs, and Abraham was fully conversant with all of them. He used to demonstrate the falsity of their ideas, and reveal the truths on which our own holy faith is founded. Some of the young people were attracted to him. As far as older people were concerned, he never even tried to draw them closer because they were already firmly entrenched in their false beliefs, and it would have been very hard to get them to change. It was the younger people who were drawn to him. They ran after him. He would go from city to city, and they would run after him. However, the parents and wives of these young people were strongly opposed to their newfound faith, saying they had fallen victim to evil influences and they had been ruined. They put up such a front of hostility that some of these young people reverted to their old ways under the weight of domestic pressure from their parents, wives, and in-laws. However, a few remained firm in their attachment to Abraham. Abraham put great effort into spreading the true faith. He wrote many books, thousands of books. He had numerous sons, and we may assume that if they were his children, they all followed the path of righteousness. Even Ishmael repented. Later on, however, when Abraham thought how he could ensure that his legacy of books and teachings would endure in the world, he pondered deeply as to which of his sons he should leave them to. In the end, he decided to leave everything to Isaac. And so he did. Isaac followed the same path as his father. He made many converts, and he was also the author of many works on faith and belief. He too wondered which of his sons he should entrust with his books and wisdom, because he was very fond of Esau, who had succeeded in deceiving Isaac about his true character to the point that Isaac loved him. Thus the Torah writes, Isaac loved Esau because he was a trapper with his mouth. Rashi explains that the words, "he was a trapper with his mouth," come to tell us that Esau used to entrap and deceive Isaac with his words, asking him questions like how to tithe salt and so on in order to endear himself to him. Despite his attachment to Esau, however, Isaac eventually realized that he should entrust his teachings to Jacob. Jacob also devoted himself to the task of drawing the younger generation closer to God, and he too wrote a phenomenal number of books about faith. Jacob taught all his sons because they were all tzaddikim, but he too wondered which of them he should entrust with the full heritage of his wisdom. In the end, he chose Levi, giving the others more generalized teachings. This is why the tribe of Levi was so much stronger and firmer in their faith than all the others, and did not worship the golden calf. Nor were they subjected to servitude in Egypt, because the tribe of Levi was stronger than all the others when it came to faith. In the same conversation, the Rebbe spoke about the means whereby a person can ensure that after his death he will come to the Zadok. In Yuman he spoke about his opposition, and the lies they had told about him. He said as if complaining, "Will I redeem them?" He was quoting from the verse in Hosea, where the prophet complains that he wanted to act only for the good of Israel, but they told lies about him. "Will I redeem them, though they have spoken lies about me?" However, the Rebbe quoted only the first words of the verse, "Will I redeem them?" He sang the words in a sweet voice in the traditional chant of the books of the prophets. Once he was speaking about his true level and the awesome sanctity he had attained. Suddenly he said, "After these things and this truth came Sancherib." He was alluding to the verses in 2 Chronicles which follow the account of the righteousness of King Hezekiah. Immediately afterwards it is written, "After these things and this truth came Sancherib." In other words, it was just because of the great heights of King Hezekiah's righteousness that Sancherib had to come, as it were, and Hezekiah suffered greatly because of him, we should no longer be surprised at the great opposition faced by true tzaddikim. It was during Rabbi Nachman's lifetime that the decrees the Russian government was later to impose against the Jews first came under consideration. I heard that once the Rebbe referred to the rumors and said he might have been able to find some means of annulling the decrees, but what could he do, since there were others who would not agree with him? He quoted the passage in Ta'anit, which recounts that in a period of calamity in the days of Rabbi Yehuda Nasiah, he decreed 13 fasts, but they were not answered. He wanted to declare more, but Rabbi Ami took issue with him. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda could not succeed, because he lacked support. Once we were discussing the subject of rhyming verse. He said, there is something to it, because the whole world, I do not remember the exact expression he used, but it was something like, the whole world follows the practice. He quoted the verse in Isaiah, he hoped for justice, but behold injustice, for righteousness, but behold an outcry. The Hebrew words rhyme. Less than on the same occasion we were making up rhymes poking fun at the emissary of the evil one. The Rebbe grew annoyed with us and said that our action did not please him. He then told us of a dream he had had in which someone was composing rhymes praising him and deriding his adversary. In the dream this rhymester turned to us, and in rhyming verse, told us how fortunate we were to have become followers of the Rebbe. He encouraged and praised us for having been worthy of this. The Rebbe repeated some of the verses that he had heard in his dream, but I have forgotten them. The Rebbe once discussed how in this world it is the low-grade people who are considered great while people's true merits are ignored. We see this very much in our times, but the Rebbe said it was a recurrent phenomenon all through history. Yet despite this there was someone tucked away in a lowly place who laughed at the whole world, while he actually sustained and supported it through his merits. His true joy was in God, and he was really and truly alive in the fullest sense of the word. There are many different kinds of life. Some people lead very troubled lives, even though it may not be apparent on the surface. Within the category of troubled lives, there are various gradations. Each person's suffering is not like anyone else's. Even someone whose life is not literally one of suffering cannot necessarily be compared to someone else. The different forms of life are very different. Undoubtedly, the life of a horse bears no comparison to the life of man. Just as there are great differences between different forms of life on the physical level, so there are differences in the quality of different people's spiritual lives. The true life is to delight in God. Some people achieve this even in this world, others not at all. Spiritual life contains all the gradations that exist within the category of physical life. The Rebbe said he was not at all jealous of the greatness of those who are considered great today. Less than, he also added, there are good Jews who haven't enough income to meet their needs. They find themselves pressured and confused because of their situation. Actually, this is most beneficial for the world, for in fact, there are precious conversations that are the direct result of this confusion. Yet there are differences. The Midrash teaches there is a state of slumber associated with prophecy, as in a slumber fell upon Abram, and a state of slumber associated with foolishness, a confused mind. Greater than, he said, all the great tzaddikim reached extraordinary levels, but having reached their level they stayed there. As for me, thank God, I become a different person at every moment. He cited the opposition he endured as proof of this. For the tzaddik is called a tree, and he has roots and branches. Now, every tzaddik, before he can attain a new level, must endure opposition, for the sages said, strife is like the inroad made by a burst of water. Strife and opposition are the category of water. It is the water, the opposition, that elevates the tzaddik. But as for me, the Rebbe continued, I need constant opposition, because I am constantly moving from level to level every moment. If I knew I am now standing where I was previously, I would reject myself completely in this world. I heard the same idea from some other followers of the Rebbe, though it was expressed slightly differently. Once some of his followers were complaining to him that they found it hard to bear the opposition and persecution they suffered. The Rebbe said to them, believe me, I have the power to make peace with the whole world, and then I would not have a single opponent. But what can I do? There are levels and palaces that are impossible to reach except through the opposition one encounters. There is proof of this in the fact that Moses himself had opposition. Moses certainly had the power to draw the whole of the Jewish people after him. It is written of him that Moses assembled the entire Israelite community, because Moses was the collective consciousness of the Jewish people, and it was within his power to assemble them all and draw them towards him. Yet despite this, it is written that they looked after Moses, which the sages interpreted negatively. There are other examples of opposition to Moses as well, for there are certain levels that cannot be reached except through the opposition one suffers. The sages said, strife is like the inroad made by a burst of water. As it is written, the beginning of strife is like letting out water. It is written that man is a tree of the field. With a tree, the more water it is given, the more it grows. His Rosh HaShanah. Rabbi Nachman said, my Rosh HaShanah is greater than everything. I cannot understand how it is that if my followers really believe in me, they are not all scrupulous about being with me for Rosh HaShanah. No one should be missing. Rosh HaShanah is my whole mission. He told us to make a public announcement that everyone who counted himself as one of his followers or took notice of what he said should come to him for Rosh HaShanah without exception. Anyone who has the privilege of being with him for Rosh HaShanah is entitled to be very, very happy. Go, eat rich foods and drink sweet drinks. For the joy of God is your strength. This verse refers to Rosh HaShanah. Someone once said to the Rebbe that he preferred being with him for Shabbat Shuvah rather than Rosh HaShanah. On Rosh HaShanah, there wasn't room for him to even stand in the synagogue, and he didn't have good lodgings where he could eat and sleep. As a result, he was so disoriented that he was unable to concentrate on his prayers. That was why he would have preferred being with the Rebbe any other time except Rosh HaShanah. The Rebbe replied, whether you eat or don't eat, whether you sleep or don't sleep, whether you pray or don't pray, i.e. with the proper concentration, just make sure to be with me for Rosh HaShanah no matter what. Yo essen nit essen, yo schlofen nit schlofen, yo davenen nit davenen, abi du sollst bei mir sein auf Rosh HaShanah, Jamrit Tohorit, Passim. All the distractions the man mentioned were really purely imaginary. They were the promptings of the evil one, because thank God it was perfectly evident that in the main people prayed with deeper concentration among the assembled Chassidim on Rosh HaShanah than they would have done had they prayed in their own hometowns. He said, my Rosh HaShanah is something completely new, and God knows that it is not something I inherited from my fathers. God himself gave me the gift of knowing what Rosh HaShanah is. That all of you are dependent on my Rosh HaShanah goes without saying. The entire world depends on my Rosh HaShanah. On the eve of the last Rosh HaShanah in Uman, we were standing round the Rebbe to give him our Zettelach, slips of paper with names, etc., written on them, and redemption money. The Rebbe asked about a certain man from Nemirov who had not come for Rosh HaShanah. Reb Naftali started giving excuses for him, but the Rebbe would not accept them and took strong exception to his absence. Afterwards, the Rebbe spoke about another person who had also not come for Rosh HaShanah owing to a variety of problems. Before Rosh HaShanah, the man in question had made a special journey to the Rebbe to tell him about his difficulties, and the Rebbe himself had told him to go home, even though it meant not being with him for Rosh HaShanah. This man was one of the Rebbe's leading followers, and it was very painful for him that he would not be with us for Rosh HaShanah. He started protesting to the Rebbe that he should not have to go home but should stay for Rosh HaShanah. The Rebbe would not be swayed, however, and sent the man home. As he did so, he said to him, I cannot even imagine the pain of your not being with me for Rosh HaShanah. If so, the man said, till stay here. But the Rebbe would not agree, and he went home. Afterwards, on Erev Rosh HaShanah, the Rebbe spoke to us about this, and said this man really did deserve great pity. He had genuinely wanted to be with us for Rosh HaShanah, but had been prevented because of the various problems. Then the Rebbe cried out from the depths of his heart, what shall I tell you? There is nothing greater, that is, than being with him for Rosh HaShanah. He then said in a voice filled with emotion, what shall I tell you? There is nothing greater, even if other great tzaddikim do not say so. Well, this will just be another question. In other words, even without this, people already had all kinds of questions about things the Rebbe said. His insistence that we should be with him for Rosh Hashanah would just be another question. There were a number of inferences from what he said on this occasion. Again, we learned of the importance of our obligation to be with him for Rosh Hashanah. We had already known about it before, but from the length at which he spoke about it now, and from his awesome gestures, we understood even more how vital it was. This is something that cannot be conveyed in writing. We also learned that he earnestly wanted us to be with him in Uman for Rosh Hashanah every year after his death, and nothing is greater than this. We also learned how determined we have to be to break the obstacles that stand in the way of any holy action, especially the barriers against being with the Rebbe for Rosh Hashanah. These, more than any, must be broken completely. One must be so determined about being with him for Rosh HaShanah that even if the Rebbe himself were to advise against coming for Rosh HaShanah, one would pay no attention. In fact, the best thing is not to even ask him, because he would be sure to say not to come, whereas in point of fact one must be absolutely insistent about being there. This applies to future generations as well. This concept of not asking relates to the sage's dictum that the path a person wants to travel is the path he is led on. Rashi cites this saying in his interpretation of the verse, "Go with the men." We find the same concept in the episode of the sending of the spies. Moses himself was compelled to send them even though he really had no desire to do so. We experienced the same thing with the Rebbe on several occasions, and especially in relation to Rosh HaShanah. There were people who faced severe obstacles against being with him for Rosh HaShanah. When they asked him personally, he answered that they should not come for Rosh HaShanah. If they protested and mentioned his warnings about the importance of being with him for Rosh HaShanah, the Rebbe responded as if he were angry with them and would not listen to another word. They acted accordingly, and did not come for Rosh HaShanah. But those of us who had the privilege of being with him often were able to infer, and indeed we heard it quite explicitly as well, that his innermost feelings were very different. It was only because they had asked about the matter in the first place that he was obliged to speak the way he did. There is a great deal to be said on this subject. A Rav or leader who is consulted about whether one should undertake something that involves self-sacrifice will inevitably answer in the negative, even though his real desire is that the questioner should indeed sacrifice himself and break all the barriers. This is why someone who really wants to draw closer and break all the barriers should avoid asking about the matter at all. Understand this well. Another thing the Rebbe said on this occasion was that there were cases of people who all through the year were unable to receive their tikkun, their rectification. On Rosh HaShanah, however, even they could. The rest of the year even he himself was unable to give them their tikkun, but on Rosh HaShanah he could. He said that on Rosh HaShanah he was able to achieve certain things, and make certain tikkunim that he was not able to do the whole of the rest of the year. Avoidance of philosophy and the importance of faith. The Rebbe spoke many times about philosophical works less than particularly, the mora nevuchim greater than, and strictly forbade us to study or even look at them. He greatly emphasized the importance of this prohibition. Such works only confuse the mind and implant unsound beliefs that are not in accordance with the wisdom of the Torah. The authors of these works do not believe in the forces of evil, and this goes contrary to everything we find in the teachings of the sages, especially the Zohar, the writings of the Karet Ari, and the Baal Shem Tov, and so on, all of which are founded on Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit, and have the power to awaken people and inspire them to serve God. Anyone who cares about his own welfare should keep well away from the various philosophical works written by earlier scholars, such as the philosophically oriented commentaries printed in the Mikreat Gedolot, editions of the Bible with commentaries, etc. There is no need to name them all. The Rebbe was also opposed to studying the Sefer HaKedah, because although the work itself was sound, it quoted the arguments of the philosophers and discussed philosophical problems. The same applied to Sha'ar HaYichud in Chovet HaLevavat, the Sefer HaKarim, the Malat HaHigayon of the Rambam, his Guide for the Perplexed, and in fact all philosophical works. They were all equally prohibited reading, because they greatly damage and confuse a person's faith. Anyone who knows nothing of them and travels the path of purity is very fortunate, for not in these is the portion of Jacob. This point has already been made several times, but it needs to be repeated time and time again because of the gravity of the prohibition, touching as it does on the very foundation of our faith. The Rebbe repeated his warning countless times. Whenever he had occasion to mention these works, he emphasized the seriousness of the prohibition against studying philosophy. He warned us to keep as far as we possibly could from such works, and not so much as glance at them. This particularly applied to the works written by the philosophers of our time, which must be avoided by anyone who wants to save himself from destruction. It was a regular thing for us to hear the Rebbe say, "It is good to give thanks to God for sending us his faithful servant, Moses, who released us from all our perplexities and gave us the Torah, commanding us to believe in God without any speculation whatsoever, and to fulfill the whole Torah and mitzvah in their literal sense." The few philosophical passages in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah in the chapters on fundamentals of the Torah, ethics, and idolatry should also be avoided completely. as should any other passages in which he discusses philosophy. Less than he said that although in the Sha'ar HaGilgalim it states that the Rambam represents the left paya sidelock of Moses, he personally was not convinced that this actually came from the Ari himself. In my opinion, the Ari is not the source of this statement. Less than another time the Rebbe spoke of a dream that he had in which he took issue with the Rambam for having written such works. According to their mistaken notions, he told us, it is impossible for God to make changes in even the most simple forms of creation, even a fly, so greatly have they erred in their nonsense. Concerning what is written in the Guide for the Perplexed, that it is not possible for a triangle to be turned into a square, the Rebbe said, I believe that God can turn a triangle into a square, for God's ways are hidden from us. He is omnipotent, and nothing is impossible for him. It is forbidden to enter into philosophical inquiries. Perfect faith in God is all that is necessary. Greater than. The Rebbe greatly derided the Rambam's comments about the idea that at the giving of the Torah, Moses employed ingenious forms of trickery. God forbid. It is forbidden to repeat such notions even by way of a joke. May God protect us from perverted ideas like these. Anyone who has entertained even a single idea of this kind is greatly to be pitied. There is no need to contradict such nonsense. It is well known that the earlier authorities protested vehemently against these philosophical works. It may be that the Rambam had his defenders, but it is well known that they defended him only out of respect for his Torah learning, because he also wrote remarkable works on all areas of Halakha, such as the Mishnah Torah. The Rebbe himself said that where the Mishnah Torah speaks about Halakha, it is an excellent work. But as far as the Guide for the Perplexed is concerned, may God forgive him for the unparalleled distortions contained in it, which reach to the very roots of the Torah. No one can deny the obvious fact that much of the book goes contrary to the Torah and rabbinic teachings. Even in the Mishnah Torah, the passages that deal with philosophy have done a great deal of damage, as explained by a number of authorities who protested bitterly against the Rambam's statement that the first 4 chapters of the Mishnah Torah contain an explanation of the chariot and the work of creation. Woe to the eyes that see such things! Woe to the heart that entertains so perverse a view as this, a view that flies in the face of all the Kabbalistic teachings handed down by the holy Tana, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, by the Ari and so on. As for you, the reader, I appreciate that you may be reluctant to insult the Rambam's honor. At all events, you should avoid looking at any of the passages that discuss philosophical issues, so as not to be corrupted like so many others today. They base their twisted ideas on passages like these and hold up these works as their shield and refuge. Think about it carefully. Which deserves greater respect and awe? The Guide for the Perplexed, based as it is on the doctrines of Aristotle the Greek 15 or the Zohar, and the writings of the Ari, which were composed by Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his companions with Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit, with the prophet Elijah as their teacher. In the case of the latter, most of their teachings were handed down from teacher to pupil from Moses himself. Where they made innovations, they did so with Ruach HaKodesh of the highest order, and their works have the power to greatly strengthen the faith we have inherited from Abraham, and give us encouragement to observe the Torah in all its fine details. The philosophical works, on the other hand, simply do the opposite. Whoever chooses the truth without deceiving himself is very fortunate. The Rebbe also said one can tell from a person's face if he has studied the Guide for the Perplexed. In other words, the faces of those who study this work change for the worse because they are bound to lose the image of God that gives holiness to the face. Everyone can see that most of the people who study these works today become total atheists, and we have to suspect them of transgressing the entire Torah. For this and other works dealing with philosophy uproot one completely from the traditional faith of Israel and from adherence to the Torah and belief in God. Such people end up totally corrupted. I myself have spoken with a number of people who are fairly observant but have studied philosophical works at some time. They all said explicitly that they greatly regretted ever having studied them, and wished they had never even heard of them. They themselves warned to keep well away from these works. Happy is one who keeps well away from them and holds himself with pure faith according to our ancestral tradition. The Jewish people believe in God without foolish and empty speculation. On Rosh HaShanah, the Rebbe spoke about the prohibition against studying Torah commentaries that take a philosophical approach, such as the works of Ibn Ezra, especially the commentary known as the Margalit, and the works of the Ralbag, etc., which are well known to contain statements contrary to the Torah. to the point that one should rend his garments on hearing a single word of them. The Rebbe said that all their basic premises are taken from Aristotle and other well-known atheists, some of whom lived before the Talmudic period and some of them during it. When the teachers of the Mishnah and Talmud introduced the prohibition against studying works dealing with Greek thought, they were aiming against these atheistic works, which were an intrinsic part of Greek culture. Wherever the word epikoros is used in rabbinic literature, it refers to those influenced to follow the ways and thinking of these atheists. Other evildoers were also described as being epikorsim because of their inclination to deny God. The reason for using the word epikoros is that the responsibility for the damage lies with the one who initiated it. There was a certain philosopher whose name was Epicurus, epikoros that he was, whose views are given prominence in philosophical works. How can someone who wants to be a Jew study works like these, built as they are on the tenets of acknowledged atheists who are the source of all the atheism in the world? It is impossible to put down in writing everything the Rebbe said on this occasion about the stringent prohibition against studying these works. He added that the only commentaries and Musar works one should study are those based on the teachings of the sages in the Talmud, the Midrashim, the Zohar, and the writings of the Ari, including the works written by the Tzaddikim of more recent times that are founded on these mountains of holiness, and follow the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Among such works are those by Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polanoy and the Likutei Amarim. The Rebbe listed a number of other works that are good to learn. Anyone with sense will be able to understand for himself which works he should avoid and which ones he should embrace, namely those based on the Talmud and Midrashim, the Zohar, the writings of the Ari, and those of the Baal Shem Tov. The Rebbe greatly derided the explanations of the mitzvah given in the Guide for the Perplexed, saying, "How could anyone imagine giving vacuous reasons like these for the sacrifices and the incense offering? How many awesome tikkunim, rectifications, are accomplished in the worlds above, worlds without end, by means of the mere recital of the words of the Torah describing these practices? In other words, if there was any substance in their fallacious theories, what use would there be in merely reciting the Torah passages in question? How can someone come and talk such nonsense about the reason for the incense, which has such profound implications that even the mere recital of the Torah account of it has an influence in the highest worlds, as mentioned in the Zohar and the writings of the Ari? In actual fact, it is impossible to comprehend the reason for the sacrifices and the incense offering. We must simply believe in the words of Moses. There is no doubt that all these practices are based on the profoundest reasons, but it is impossible for the human mind to grasp them. So great are these practices that even the mere recital of the Torah passages describing them has the power to bring about awesome tikkunim in all the worlds. The same applies to the reasons behind all the mitzvah. They are supremely exalted and hidden from the eye of all living beings. As it is written, "It is hidden from the eyes of all the living, and your testimonies are wonderful." I once heard the Rebbe say that studying these philosophical works is like going through a desolate wilderness where one never meets anyone. Similarly, going into these works one never finds anything holy. As for the fact that the Rebbe himself studied philosophical works from time to time, this is the concept of the journey of the Israelites through the desert. The desert is the place of the forces of evil. We find in the Zohar that the reason the Israelites traveled through the desert was that in so doing they trampled on the forces of evil. This was the Rebbe's purpose in studying these works which were a desert. Understand this. For us, however, it is strictly prohibited to look into these works. See also the lesson Come to Pharaoh, which explains the prohibition against entering into philosophical speculation, deriving as it does from the empty void. The lesson also explains why the very great Tzaddik is obliged to go into such works in order to elevate the souls that have fallen there. The Rebbe once spoke about a comic entertainer from Lemberg whose repertoire included a song that had the words, "The old, old, old God" in one of its verses. The Rebbe repeated the word "old" several times, just like the comedian did when he sang the song. The comedian used to say the words "old, old, old" over and over again before finishing with the word God. And so did the Rebbe when he mentioned the song. The Rebbe's purpose was clear. He wanted to instill in us the simple faith we had to have in God as the Ancient One, older than the oldest. Our faith is an inheritance from our earliest ancestors, the Holy Patriarchs. Anyone who had the privilege of hearing the Rebbe's words would have understood this, and even today it is possible to understand a little. The Rebbe spoke about this comedian time and time again to different people, and each time he mentioned him, he would repeat the words, old, 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 over and over again. Not only did the Rebbe reveal the most awesome of lessons, the like of which had never been heard, and tell the most unique stories, he also spoke to us a great deal in a more intimate, day-to-day conversational way. All he wanted was to instill us with faith and strengthen our determination to fulfill the Torah and mitzvah, which themselves depend on faith. In many ways he treated us as if he were a father teaching his little son. The father has to come down to the level of the boy in order to introduce him gently to the study of Torah and keeping the mitzvah. Similarly, only thousands of times more so, the Rebbe would lower himself to our level and clothe himself in all kinds of different garments, talking to us about what appeared to be everyday matters, until eventually a conversation about serving God would develop. And in fact, even the mundane subjects he mentioned before coming to the subject of devotion were also entirely Torah. Only at first we did not understand the teachings implicit in what he was saying. It was only as we moved from topic to topic that a conversation having a direct and obvious bearing on devotion would emerge. The Rebbe's whole purpose in all this was to spread faith in God. It was something extraordinary to be with him, to hear his wisdom and experience his simplicity. Every word he said and every movement he made, in their awesome holiness and purity, contained the most profound and amazing wisdom, while at the same time total simplicity and purity, for simplicity and true wisdom are one and the same thing. Someone once asked the Rebbe a question about the statement in the Shulchan Aruch that when a person mentions God's name in the course of his prayers, he should have in mind the meaning of the name, as it is read Adonai, that God is the Adon Lord of all, and the meaning of the name as it is written, YHVH, that he was, is, and will be eternally. The Rebbe said to him, "Isn't the literal meaning enough for you? Adonai, God, by concentrating on the simple meaning alone, your hands and legs and all 248 limbs and 365 sinews are bound to tremble." I heard the Rebbe make a similar point on another occasion. This was in Uman when he was staying in the house of Nachman Nozan. One night after his evening meal I was left alone with him. After finishing the grace after meals, the Rebbe sat in silence. Then he said in a tone of awe and fear, God. When he started to say the name of God, he was shaking and trembling so much that he could say only half of the word. But then the whole word God came from his holy lips with tremendous awe and fear. Like an arrow shot by a mighty warrior, his simple intention was to demonstrate the degree of awe that the very name of God should command. We should quake and tremble in fear of his name, for he fills the whole world and stands over us at all times. It is impossible to express this adequately in writing, but those who understand and seek the truth will be able to draw out the implications for themselves, and strengthen themselves with the simple faith and belief that the whole earth is full of God's glory, and that God is with us at all times. Think carefully about what I have written here, until you are filled with awe and fear of God. It is explained in Likutei Moharan that the solution to the paradox of free will and foreknowledge comes into the category of the encompassing wisdom, which man can enter only in the future. The Rebbe once said he already had the right answer to this paradox, and that the answer was completely clear, for it was never his way to say anything that left grounds for uncertainty. Everything he said was clear and white as a sheet. He had already written this solution down, but the manuscript had been lost, and now he had forgotten what he had written. This was always his way. Any original ideas he developed, he would subsequently ignore completely, paying no further attention to them. All he ever wanted was something new. I once heard him say that one thing that is impossible to understand is how free will is contained within knowledge itself. The Rebbe once gave us a proof that the world was created out of nothingness. Were it not for this, how could there be room to hold all the inhabitants of the world? It is an irrefutable fact that the human population is constantly increasing. From any one person innumerable generations may issue forth, thousands and tens of thousands of souls. If what they say were true, that is the theory of the atheists, who hold that the world has always existed, and that space and time are limitless, the whole world should have been completely filled up by now, and there would not be enough room in the world, finite as it is, to hold everyone. Seeing that the population is constantly increasing at such a high rate, another time the Rebbe gave us a second proof, this time from the dead. When someone dies and is buried in the earth, the size of the earth is increased however slightly. Even after he rots and becomes just a handful of dust, we must still say that at least some addition has been made to the dust of the earth. By now the whole world should have gotten so big that it reached to the very heavens and beyond. That is, according to the confused and twisted view of the atheists. If so, how could there be enough room in the world to hold the constant and unending increases in the size of the world? For at least something gets added each time someone is buried, and the number of dead is limitless. According to their twisted view, i.e., that the world has always existed, there would be no room to hold them all. Understand this well, because these proofs are conclusive for anyone who is prepared to accept the truth without obstinately wishing to deny it for the sake of it. The first is proof from the living, the second from the dead. However, there is no real need to get involved with proofs and speculation. All we need is simple faith in God. We should believe unquestioningly that God created the world in 6 days, as it is written, "In the beginning God created heaven and earth." My only reason for recording the above is that they are the words of the Rebbe himself, and it is not right for a single one to get lost. This is why I have not refrained from including these 2 conversations, in order to pull the theories of the atheists to pieces, and show how confused and foolish they are. For if they will examine these 2 proofs honestly, they will see quite clearly that they are incontrovertible, and then perhaps their eyes will be opened and they will return to the truth. As for us, however, we have no need of proofs, even the proofs given above, for we are believers, the sons of believers, the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we believe in God and His holy Torah unquestioningly and with perfect faith. Faith is the foundation of the whole Torah, as the sages said. Came Habakkuk and reduced everything to one principle. The Zadok will live through his faith. There were rumors that the Tsar wanted to introduce a number of decrees against the Jews, including a regulation requiring Jewish children to be taught secular studies and foreign languages. Regarding this decree, the Rebbe said that the Jews should call a fast and cry out to God more vehemently than against all the other decrees. This decree was more calamitous than any other evil in the world, since it would turn the children against religion completely, as we have indeed seen because of our many sins. The brutal fact is that anyone who enters this path becomes totally estranged from religion. May God take pity on His people Israel and save a remnant of all their throngs. The Rebbe once said, "Oi, oi to us that we do not devote the least thought to how we can save our children and the generations to come from these evil, storm-tossed waters that threaten to engulf the entire world, God forbid." For this is the only way to describe the spread of secular studies, the study of foreign languages and philosophy. I heard that the Rebbe once said, "I am a know what to answer the atheist." I also heard that he said, "I and my followers." The Rebbe said to me, "There are many things that at first were secret but later on were allowed to be revealed. For example, there are certain ideas in the Kabbalah that prior to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and the Ari were highly secret and were not discussed at all except in the strictest secrecy. Later on, however, in the days of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and the Ari, they no longer had to be kept secret, and it was permitted to reveal them to some degree. In the same way, there are many things that today are secrets, but that in time to come will no longer be secret. Something similar applied to philosophical works, some of which were written by prominent scholars and held in high regard, less than particularly the Guide for the Perplexed greater than. Yet the Rebbe warned us not to look at them at all, because they are directly opposed to the Torah. Someone told me that the Rebbe said, "It is very good when a person is privileged to enter the portals of faith and tour about within. There are numberless halls and chambers, and one can go in and wander from room to room and palace to palace. The paths are well trodden. They are truly remarkable paths. From there one goes further and wanders through the palaces of trust and so on. After this one goes further and further. How fortunate are those who enter and wander around these palaces." He said, "The tzaddikim are very precious in God's eyes, even the tzaddikim of today. Even if their only merit was the fact that they distance themselves from the vulgar lifestyle that is so prevalent, that in itself is sufficiently great. For today there are all too many people who have embraced the lifestyle of the Gentiles and adopted the outlook of philosophy and speculation. Their whole aim is to model themselves after the Gentiles in all their ways, be it clothing, lifestyle, or whatever. It is enough that the tzaddikim distance themselves from these people. For regardless of the level of their religious devotions, today's religious leaders have at least detached themselves from today's vulgar lifestyle, as have their followers. The mere fact that they are careful not to grow their hair long, except for their side locks, ensures that they do not follow the current fashions in hairstyles for men. This automatically distances them from the lifestyle of the Gentiles and the circles of the free thinkers and philosophers. This in itself is a very great thing, because philosophy and speculation are the worst of all evils, Anyone who keeps well away from them is very fortunate. The Rebbe also said, even the tzaddikim today come into the category of assimilation, because in their homes they conduct themselves like princes and aristocrats. It is a fact that people often say these days that the tzaddikim live like princes. Because of this they must be counted as being assimilated, and this is why they are unable to teach Torah. It may be true that they teach a little in order to meet the needs of their followers, but Torah in the absolute sense they cannot teach. And since they do not know Torah, they do not know anything. Even prophecy is on a lesser level than Torah, for the Torah is greater than everything and includes everything. The one depends on the other. The leaders who conduct themselves like princes are ignorant of Torah, and indeed their very ignorance of the Torah is the reason they have to conduct themselves like princes. Being ignorant of Torah, they are bound to conduct themselves like princes at least, for otherwise how would anyone know they were important, seeing as they are not Torah scholars? Thus it is written, her king and her ministers are among the nations, there is no Torah. Even her prophets have not found a vision from God. The Rebbe said, something you are not aware of is that in Germany, the Zohar is not available, even though it might be printed there. The Zohar is not available there. All the copies are sold in our regions, and it is because the Zohar is not to be found there that they go around dressed in the same clothes as the Germans, for clothes are the concept of the makif, transcendent, and because of this it is most important to take care that one's clothes are clean and neat. The Rebbe stopped in the middle of what he was saying, and never explained the relationship between the clothes worn in Germany and the fact that copies of the Zohar are not to be found there. Of philosophy, he said, the philosophers have indeed considered the greatness and exaltedness of God, and their speculations do point to the sublime majesty of God, a greatness that is beyond the power of thought to conceive, but they are entirely unable to deduce a single mitzvah of the Torah from all their speculation. Indeed, this is quite impossible, and this is why they deny the Torah so vehemently. This is the reason it is so important to avoid them. The Rebbe took issue with the theory of Shemaitat, cycles of time, as explained in certain Kabbalistic works. Less than each time he spoke of this, he would express his disagreement. The work Sha'ari Gan Eden, which had recently been reissued, did not find favor in his eyes precisely because it was based on the theory of Shemaitat. He once said explicitly that this theory was incorrect. We wanted him to say more about it. And what would be if I did reveal more? He retorted. Haven't I already told you enough of what is involved here? He did not want to say anything else, other than to make it clear that it was not the way people maintained greater than, and he said that the Ari also disagreed completely with these ideas. Less than as for the question raised at the beginning of Sha'ari Gan Eden, it is not really answered by the solution based on the theory of Shemaitat. Ultimately, even this solution requires our relying on faith alone, as it is forbidden to investigate what existed prior to creation. Is it not better then not to even start with this philosophical investigation, but rather to rely on faith from the outset? This applies to all questions and speculations concerning God's exalted ways and the creation of the world. He made this point time and again. Philosophical inquiries are forbidden. Faith in God is all that is necessary. The theory of Shemaitat is also rejected by the author of the Shivchi Hari, who states that those who claim that the world was previously in the cycle of loving kindness and is now in the cycle of fear are mistaken. The early disciples of the Ari's Kabbalah heard certain concepts from their teacher, and they incorrectly added the Shemaitat theory on their own, greater than. Once the Rebbe said, through faith a person can reach such a state of longing that he does not know what he is longing for, and he can only cry out, Gewalt, bind me, I want to be a Jew. Less than the Rebbe once discussed the debate then taking place among the scientists of his day. One opinion maintained that the planets were in motion revolving around the Earth. The second opinion argued that it was the Earth that rotated and revolved. According to their explanations, the Earth did not fall because of the great speed at which it was rotating on its axis. This was borne out by an experiment involving a circular object and a cup full of water. The circular object had the cup placed inside it, and was then spun around at a high speed. Not one drop of water fell from the cup. This was seen as proof for why the Earth remains fixed in the sky. The Rebbe, however, did not agree with this reasoning. Rather, he sided with the first opinion, citing the verse, the Earth stands forever, greater than, less than there is a certain type of bird of which there is only one in the world. When this bird grows old, it becomes weak. Realizing this, the bird flies to the top of a mountain where it builds a nest from all different types of fragrant leaves. The bird sits on the nest until it feels its strength returning. It then begins to fly up higher and higher towards the sun. Eventually this bird is burned by the sun's heat and falls into the sea, where it drowns. Another bird is then created in its stead. Greater than less than there is a certain worm that is created on a tree. This worm remains on the tree inside a shelter made of mud. After investigation there were those who concluded that this shelter was the work of sorcery. The Rebbe disagreed with their conclusion. He said that the worm built the shelter from its own bodily coolness and the dust in the air. When the dust falls on the moisture, a shell is formed around the worm greater than his wit. Seek peace and pursue it. The Rebbe said, our sages commented, seek peace in your place and pursue it from a different place. In other words, there are times when one must be at peace with the enemies of God themselves, and because of this they will pursue him from another place. Understand this. The sages said, harlots apply makeup to one another. Should not Torah scholars do so? Should they not honor one another? Koi shikin, all the more so. The Rebbe said he dreamed a number of interpretations of this saying. One explanation is as follows. The Talmud is asking, if harlots apply makeup to one another, should not Torah scholars do so? In other words, the question is, if harlots apply makeup to one another, why do Torah scholars not give honor to one another? The words that follow, koi shikin, are to be taken as the answer to this question. Thus the Talmud is to be interpreted as giving the reason why Torah scholars do not give honor to one another. The reason is koi shikin, all the more so, a phrase that alludes to money, for we find elsewhere that the same phrase koi shikin is used with the connotation of money. The sages said, if length of days is in her the Torah's right hand, are not wealth and money koi shikin, all the more so. A second interpretation of the same statement, harlots apply makeup to one another. Because of this, Torah scholars not koi shikin. In other words, we can take the Talmudic statement as an explanation of why Torah scholars do not have money, which as we have seen is alluded to in the phrase koi shikin. Thus if we find that Torah scholars not koi shikin, that is, Torah scholars do not have koi shikin equals money, the reason for this is because harlots apply makeup to one another, for Torah scholars are called roa shepherds, but when immorality is rife they are called roa zonit, companions of harlots, and he who keeps company with harlots loses his wealth. The third interpretation of the statement in the Talmud, harlots apply makeup to one another, Torah scholars, that is, the Talmud is asking, when will Torah scholars apply makeup to one another, in the sense of giving honor to each other? And the answer is, not, koi shikin equals money, that is, they will do so when they are no longer subject to the least craving for money. I heard a witticism in the name of the Rebbe. Ever since the Russian Tsar conquered the country, the money has become dross and the drink, punch. Punch is a drink made of wine and honey mixed with water. Your silver has become dross, your wine mixed with water. From a manuscript, the Chazan of Breslov had wanted to go to the town of Tomshpol for Shabbat Shira, but he had not reached his destination and had spent the Shabbat in a village instead. Since the Torah reading was Bishalach, the Rebbe remarked, God did not lead them by way of the land of Tomshpol. A play on the opening words of the Torah portion, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Pelishtim Philistines. The letters of Pelishtim are the same as the letters of to Mshpil. Against obstinacy and impatience. The Rebbe said, I am very positive about all the things I say and do, because I always have many reasons for them. And one of the things I am very firm about is not giving advice in the form of orders. Whenever the Rebbe gave advice, he never did so in the form of orders that had to be carried out exactly as he specified. His way was rather to offer guidance in the form of a good suggestion. The recipient was then free to follow it or not, as he chose. Certainly the Rebbe wanted people to follow his advice, but he would never insist that everything should be precisely as he wished. If it went that way, well and good, if not then not. I have many reasons for this, he said, and I also know that anything good in this world is never perfect. No matter what good there is in this world, something bad is bound to develop out of it, because it is impossible for the good in this world to be perfect. For this reason the Rebbe was unwilling to insist that people should do exactly what he himself wanted them to. He did not want them to be angry with him later on, when something bad developed as a result, and then blame him for his advice. The Rebbe had the same approach to everything. He would never try to force the issue or insist that things should be exactly as he wished. He would never even try to press his attendant to do what he had to immediately. When you are trying to fall asleep and you find you cannot, never try to force yourself to sleep. The more you try forcing yourself, the more sleep will elude you. The same applies to everything in the world. You should never try to force yourself too hard in anything, because the more you try forcing yourself, the stronger the opposing forces become. There are times when this applies even to prayer and devotion. Certainly you should be extremely diligent, and make every effort to sanctify your life and reach a level of true devotion, where something can be done today, never leave it for tomorrow. The world does not stop even for a moment. Anything you can do to serve God should be done immediately and determinedly, without delay. Who knows what obstacles, outer and inner, you will face if you leave it until later. Man's world consists only of the present. However, there are times when you see that in spite of all your efforts and determination, you cannot seem to succeed in what you want. Sometimes you must simply wait. Don't be discouraged because you are not achieving what you want. Don't let this push you off course. You must wait a little until the time comes. This is something that cannot be adequately explained in writing. The Rebbe himself was quite unique in this respect. No one could match the speed and diligence with which he did things. Anything that had to be done, even if it concerned merely physical needs, he would do immediately, and with amazing speed. This was certainly true when it came to spiritual tasks. Yet at the same time, the Rebbe was always extraordinarily composed. If he saw that with all his efforts he still was not succeeding, he always remained patient and relaxed. The only important thing is to look towards God at all times with longing and yearning, even when things are not going as well as you might like with your prayers and devotions. Never despair, no matter what. As soon as God gives you the opportunity to do something holy, do it immediately. It is impossible to explain this in writing. But if you are intelligent and you want the truth, you will be able to find guidance as to how to succeed in your devotions. He said that if teachers push a young child too much, the child ends up knowing nothing. It takes great skill to teach a child at the right pace without being too stern or pushing too hard. This way a child can grasp much more and more easily. Too often the teacher tries to drum something into the child's memory, saying, "Remember, remember." If the teacher would review the lesson using a lighter touch, the child would grasp what he had to learn very well and remember it. However, by repeating so many times, "Remember, remember," if you were to ask the child later on to explain the meaning of the verse he learned, he might well answer that it meant "remember, remember." The child thinks these words are the translation of the verse. If you push a child too hard, you can easily confuse him altogether. It is hard to explain this clearly, but the idea should be clear to anyone with intelligence. It is something teachers need to be aware of, and it applies in other spheres as well. As a fundamental principle, one should never try to push himself too hard in any area. Just go forward smoothly and steadily. It is very hard to explain this, but there is a story that illustrates the point very well. There was a small boy whose father was taking him to see the Rebbe. All along the way, the father kept telling the boy that when they gave him something to drink, he should introduce the blessing with the customary Savri Maranan Varabanan, "Attention, my masters and teachers." The father rehearsed this with the child over and over again so that he would remember and not make any mistakes. Afterwards, when the child came to the Rebbe and started saying Savri, he couldn't say it at all and became very confused. The Rebbe said to his father, "Clearly you tried to drum it into him to say Savri correctly, and that's why he can't say anything at all now. If you hadn't gone over it with him so much, he would certainly be able to say it properly now." That was when the Rebbe discussed the whole subject as recorded above. Once, when the Rebbe had one of his coughing attacks, he needed to bring up phlegm, but he was unable to. He did not try to force himself, however, and a little later the phlegm came up by itself quite easily. I was with him at the time, and he said to me, "Even from this we can see that you cannot force yourself too much over anything. At first I could not bring up the phlegm, but I relaxed and made no effort to force myself. It soon came up by itself." The Rebbe gestured as if to indicate that the same principle applied to everything. One should never insist that everything should go exactly as he wants, not even when the thing he wants is genuinely holy. Where one can do something immediately, he should certainly act swiftly. Something holy should never be delayed even for a moment. On the contrary, one should make every effort to do it as quickly as possible. But if despite everything he still cannot do it at once, he should not become anxious and agitated. He should relax and wait quietly for God to help, and raise his eyes on high in the hope of succeeding in the end. God will almost always help him later on to accomplish what he wants. He said more than this, but some things can only be given over orally. When I wrote out the Aleph Bet book, the Rebbe would dictate from his notes, and I would write. It took a long time to finish the work. because when we first started I wrote only about half a folio, and after this there was no opportunity to continue until 3 or 4 months later. Then I sat with him and wrote a little more. But after this nothing was done for a period of about 2 years. Then before Hanukkah I stayed in Breslov for about 3 weeks, and it was then that I completed the writing of the Aleph Bet book. Every day I would sit with him writing for several hours without a break until the work was finished, thank God. For the Rebbe it was a very onerous task, but out of his love for the Jewish people, he would throw all of his energies into anything that stood to benefit the community as a whole. There was one occasion when I spent nearly the entire day writing at his dictation. Towards evening he said, "Let's make a reckoning of what we've done today." Well, we prayed, and we also learned a bit, and afterwards we wrote. And this is also learning, because writing down Torah teachings counts as a form of learning. Then he added, "Whatever I have to accomplish, I always want to do it and finish it immediately without delay, without leaving it for another time. Had it been possible to complete the writing of the Aleph Bet book in a single day, I would have gladly done it." Indeed, the Rebbe was always extremely quick to do whatever needed to be done. He would do it immediately and without delay. This even applied to everyday affairs. Whatever came up, he would try to deal with it immediately so as not to be bothered by it later on. For he knew that if he did not do it immediately, he might never get around to doing it, because later on he would not want to have to think about it at all. His mind was always taken up with what was necessary for his devotions, and because of this he wanted to see to whatever needed doing, including everyday affairs, immediately and without delay. Even when he wanted to study or perform some other holy task, if something came up that needed attention, even if it was not holy as such in itself, he would usually try to get it done as quickly as he could in order to free himself from it, and have his mind unencumbered. However, if he could not do it immediately, he would never become agitated. If he could do it later, the next day or some other time, he would do it, and if not, then not. He was never in the least bit tense or agitated about anything. But these things cannot be explained in writing at all. The Rebbe prescribed for me a regular schedule of learning, and it meant that I had to cover a lot of ground each day. Besides this, the Rebbe told me I should see to it that I spent a certain amount of time each day in conversation with other people in order to relax my mind. This despite the fact that the day was scarcely long enough for me to complete my prescribed studies. Nevertheless, the Rebbe said it was most important to rest my mind through talking to other people for a certain period each day. In Likuti Maharan I, it is explained that talking to other people is like sleep, in that it relaxes the mind. In addition, the Rebbe later told me that even in the course of one's studies one needs to pause and rest from time to time in order to relax the mind. One should simply let his thoughts go free for a time. As long as they do not stray outside the bounds of holiness into the realm of evil thoughts and fantasies. At that time the Rebbe wanted me to finish all 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch within a year, and he set me a quota of 5 pages a day. I followed this routine for about half a year, and finished the whole of Orach Chaim together with the Magen Avraham, and the Turi Zahav, and almost all of Yoreh De'ahi 1. After this, however, all kinds of obstacles and difficulties arose, and I was not able to complete the daily quota of studies the Rebbe had prescribed. The Rebbe then told me I should study Kabbalah as well, and it was not until some years later that I was able to complete all 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch in their entirety. I was very upset about this, but once when I spoke to the Rebbe about it, he comforted me, saying, "Surely this is something unique to us that we want to finish everything promptly. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, they can spend 3 or 4 years on futility and get nothing at all for their labor." What he wanted to convey was that one can never force the issue, no matter how much one may want to finish everything at once. If he sees that it is impossible and the obstacles are springing up on all sides, he should not allow himself to get thrown off course. He should calmly do whatever he can, hoping and waiting for God's help until in the end he succeeds in completing the task. Despite what I wrote earlier, that it is impossible to explain this in writing, I have nonetheless noted these points briefly. Anyone who genuinely wants to will be able to derive much guidance and encouragement as to how to serve God with determination and vigor, while at the same time never trying to force matters or allowing himself to get thrown off course if things do not go his way. One should always be patient and wait, and wait, and wait. until God looks down from heaven and sees. With thanks to God, this advice has helped me greatly, and I still await God's help with confidence, for I know that God will eventually complete things for me. Hitbodedut, Seclusion and Meditation. When the Rebbe told me about Hitbodedut, going to a secluded place and meditating and conversing with God, I said, "But surely man has free will." The Rebbe did not answer me explicitly, only indirectly, as if to say, "But even so," meaning that even though he might not be able to explain this matter to me completely, it was still necessary to follow this practice. I could not ask further because I knew that the same question applies to all the existing prayers arranged by the sages on such subjects as repentance and drawing close to God, as for example the blessing "Return us" in the daily Shemoneh Esrei prayer, and so on. From a manuscript written by a member of our group, the Rebbe said it is good for a person to say during his meditation, "Today I am beginning to be attached to you." Each time one should make a new start because whatever comes later always goes according to the beginning. Even the philosophers say that the start is half of the deed. Whatever happens, it is always good to make a new start each time and say, "Today I am beginning." Suppose things were already good, now they will be even better, and if they were not good before, God forbid, then it is certainly necessary to start anew. Once the Rebbe spoke to us at length about the importance of Hitbodedut. He spoke in extravagant terms about the greatness of this practice, and he said that while it was impossible to tell people to follow it for more than an hour a day, for fear that it would be unduly burdensome for them, the truth was that they really needed to spend the whole day in secluded meditation and prayer. The Rebbe said many beautiful things about Hitbodedut, saying that this practice is above all else. He said, "You know, it is even possible to whisper to a pistol not to fire because the power of speech is very great. Understand this well." The Rebbe continued talking about this for the whole day. Whoever follows this practice regularly is very fortunate. On the last Rosh HaShanah in Uman, the Rebbe's grandson was with him, Yisrael, son of the Rebbe's son-in-law Reb Yitzchak Isaac from Kremenchug. The little boy was then only 3 or 4 years old. It was very close to the Rebbe's death and he was in a very serious condition. He said to his grandson Yisrael, "Pray to God that I should become well again." The little boy replied, "Give me your watch and I will pray for you." The Rebbe said, "You see, he's already a Rebbe because he tends me to give him something in order for him to pray." The Rebbe gave him the watch, and the little boy took it, went aside and said, God, let my Zida, my grandfather, be well." The people standing there started smiling, but the Rebbe said, "This is how we have to ask things of God. What other way is there to pray to God? In other words, the essence of praying to God is total simplicity. To speak to God like a child talking to his father, or the way a person talks with a friend." The Rebbe said, when a person is meditating, even if he can say nothing except the words "Master of the world," this is also very good. He said it is possible to recognize whether a person meditates or not. One man was told by the Rebbe to meditate once by day and once at night. Once the Rebbe asked one of his followers if he groaned and sighed a great deal during his Hitbodedut. "Yes," he replied. The Rebbe pressed him and asked if he groaned and sighed from the very depths of his heart. The Rebbe told him, "When I groan and sigh, if my hand happens to be lying on the table as I sigh, I am so exhausted afterwards that it is impossible for me to lift my hand off the table, and I have to wait a while until my strength returns." On another occasion, the Rebbe gripped Reb Shemuel Isaac's clothes next to the heart and said, "Just because of a little bit of blood like this in your heart, will you lose this world and the next? Make it a habit to cry and groan until you get rid of it and subdue the evil in your heart. Then you will reach the stage where my heart is void within me." The Rebbe told Reb Yaakov Yosef of Zalatipolia a story. There was once a certain king who sent his son to distant places to study. Once the king gave his son instructions, take a particular stone that was as big as a millstone, lift it and carry it up to the top floor of the palace. Needless to say, the prince could not even lift the stone, it was so big and heavy. The prince was very upset that he could not fulfill his father's wish. Eventually, however, the king opened himself to his son, saying, "Did you really imagine I would tell you to do something as difficult as that? Would I tell you to take the stone just as it is? Lift it and take it up there. Even with all your wisdom, how could you have done something like this? That was not my intention at all. What I wanted you to do was take a strong hammer and strike the stone until you smash it into little pieces. This way you will be able to bring it up to the top floor." In the same way, God commanded us to lift our heart with our hands to God in heaven. Our heart is a heart of stone, a very heavy stone, and there is no possible way of raising it up to God except by taking a hammer and breaking and smashing the heart of stone. Then we will be able to raise it up. The hammer is speech. Understand this. Once the Rebbe was saying how important it is to recite many psalms, prayers, and supplications, and to spend much time in secluded meditation. Reb Yudel asked him, "How do we get the heart? How can we speak with true arousal of the heart?" The Rebbe said in reply, "Tell me, from which tzaddik did you receive arousal of the heart? The main thing is actually saying the words with your lips. In other words, through offering many prayers and supplications and articulating the words with our mouths, the heart becomes aroused automatically." Reb Shemuel Isaac, who was one of the Rebbe's most prominent followers, was told by the Rebbe that during Hitbodedut he should speak in turn to each of the limbs and organs of his body, explaining to them that all bodily desires are futile, because in the end man is destined to die. The body is then taken to the grave and all the limbs and organs rot, etc. He, Reb Shemuel Isaac, was still young when the Rebbe told him to follow this practice. He did so for a time, but then he came to the Rebbe and complained that his body did not listen, and it remained insensitive to all his arguments. The Rebbe said, "Don't be discouraged, carry on and don't relax your efforts. Later on you will see results." The man heeded the Rebbe's advice and followed it faithfully. Eventually he reached a level where any limb or organ he spoke to individually was so responsive to his words that the very life would ebb out of it, leaving it completely devoid of strength or sensation. This was actually visible in the case of his external limbs, such as his fingers and toes. Regarding the vital internal organs, such as his heart and so on, he actually had to hold back when speaking to them, for fear that the life would quite literally leave them, God forbid. Once he, Reb Shemuel Isaac, was talking to a group of people who were close to him about the fact that this world is nothing. What is the purpose of man's bodily functions, and so on and so on. While he was speaking, he fainted, and all his energy drained away, until it seemed that he would actually die. It was only with great effort that he was resuscitated and became conscious again. He then said that the Rebbe's holy influence had enabled him to reach a level where every time he brought himself to full awareness of the terrible punishments awaiting the wicked and the destined end of everything worldly, all his limbs down to his little toe would literally feel as if they were already laid out in the grave and rotting. The feeling was so intense that he needed great determination to hold on to his life, for otherwise his soul would have lightly gone out of him, God forbid. I heard that the Rebbe also said to a number of other people, "Because your body is so gross and strong and forceful, you must weary it with words of holiness about the ultimate goal of life." It goes without saying that one should also give himself words of encouragement in order to inspire and motivate himself so as not to give up completely, God forbid. This idea appears in the songs and verses by the Rebbe, printed in the beginning of Likutei Moharan and in the Rebbe's poem, now known as Shir Yedidit, in the verse beginning Chazak, be strong, and in many places in his writings. It is also the idea underlying the prayers we say each morning. What are we? What is our life, except for the soul? But we are your people. How fortunate we are.